Hello and welcome to The Nation. You're joining me, Elaine Noor Abdullah. It's a fabulous day today as we discuss the topic of appreciating Bahasa Melayu. Now, Bahasa Melayu is a distinguished and classy language befitting its stature as our national language. And the language is infused with finesse and subtleties, making it one of the most beautiful languages in the world. Now, have we done enough, though, to lift our national language? How far do we appreciate Bahasa Melayu? Joining me now today is EDDIN co-founder of PUSAKA and senior fellow ISIS Malaysia. And slightly later, we'll be joined by Dr. KABUYE SULAIMAN, assistant professor from IIUM, as well as NORDIN ABDULLAH, crisis management analyst, to weigh in on the topic. But first, EDDIN, hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us here on Bernama. And we're talking about the topic of Bahasa Melayu. How are you doing today?
Thanks very much for having me. I hope I'm audible, Elaine, please.
Yes, you are loud and clear, and we see you clearly as well. Now let's kickstart this conversation with a little bit of history of Bahasa Melayu and the little known facts that most Malaysians do not know. Please enlighten us.
Bahasa Melayu is one of the most cosmopolitan languages in the world. It's made up or evolved out of huge composite of influences. Its etymology is very interesting and sprawls the world, really, which is very fitting of a diasporic language. It has, of course, taken on various forms, especially following the post-colonial period, whereby the Malay language, Bahasa Melayu, which really is, for example, originally a dialect-based language,
Right.
but eventually became kind of the lingua franca of the region, even before colonial times. But after colonial times was adopted as the national language by several countries in its different reincarnations, yeah. So you have Bahasa Melayu settling as the national language of Malaya at that time. Brunei, of course, once it gained its independence, adopted Bahasa Melayu as the national language of Brunei. It is still the national language of Singapore. We need to remember
Yes,
that. And
exactly.
of course, it evolved as a result of so many different historical realities to be known today as Bahasa Indonesia. Yeah.
That's right.
So that's a very brief entry point into this marvelously complex and polyglot language.
Now, of course, we're talking about an article from Utusan Malaysia published on the 14th of March, and saying that the efforts to uplift Bahasa Melayu in this country has failed due to various factors. One is that the rakyat underestimates and assumes that our national language is not an ideal medium to communicate knowledge, or at least that's the approximation. What do you think they're trying to establish with this statement, Edith?
Let me direct that. Let me grapple with that almost directly. Yeah, I think a lot of people are getting very weary about blaming the rakyat for the failures of uplifting the Malay language.
Right.
There are two parallel realities going on here. Yeah, one is the official bureaucratic approach to a language, which is now being regarded with a great deal of cynicism by not only people who want to learn Malay or who want to uplift Malay, but those who are already actually very fluent in Bahasa Melayu. Yeah? The second path is, of course, one that is being committed to on an autonomous, individualistic basis. Yeah, I think the Malay language is going through a kind of renaissance, actually, in
Right.
terms of the kind of publishing that is taking place, the kind of translation work that is taking place. But all
Right.
of this is being done outside of the more official institutional paths. The
Right.
Malay language is also much sought after in a place like Singapore, for example. There are many people who are now starting to go back to the Malay language, learn it in places like Europe and so on. The studies of the Malay language are starting to find a new life, where at one time it took second place to Bahasa Indonesia, the study of Bahasa Indonesia. It is now being revivified. So this constant kind of keluhan or cry and moaning about the state of the national language is a problem with how ineffective the official and institutional approaches are to reviving the language, while on an independent and autonomous level, the Malay language, I think, is going through a kind of has a new spirit altogether. That the two don't connect is perhaps the problem. And of course, I will take this opportunity to say that I think efforts such as the recent one to just try and bring Malay language as the second language of ASEAN is very laudable.
Yep.
But I think first we need to have a very clear idea of where the Malay language is at the moment, and it must not be rooted in this sense of self-loathing and somehow cynicism about where the Malay language is at the moment. I think the Malay language is doing very well all over the world, and I think it's our officialdom. If they have a problem, if officialdom has a problem dealing with languages beyond Malay, then they have to be selfless and profess and admit to that rather than blame the Malay language as a whole.
But I agree. I have seen that it has sort of a life of its own elsewhere, not just locally here being utilized, but you find that I've encountered the Malay language being utilized elsewhere, and a lot of people who are not even in this region who are interested to learn the language. So that's very interesting to me. Now, there's also another question. Do you agree that some Malaysians struggle to converse in Bahasa Melayu? And we always say broken English, right? But we celebrate broken Bahasa in comedy as spoken by Indian or Chinese slapstick comedians back in the day. What about broken BM? What's your thoughts on this?
What is broken BM? I'm not sure. What does that mean?
I'm not sure either, because
BM?
I think
we have to understand that language is organic. It is
Right.
bahan semula jadi, benda yang semula jadi. It has a life of its own, and sometimes it falls on the tongue and the palate in very, very different ways. I mean, what you refer to Cockney English as broken English? I'm not sure. It's still English. It's just a different variety, and I think standardization is very dangerous to a language. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Malay language perhaps has been struggling with its own self, because of course it comes in a variety of tongues, and somehow we don't acknowledge these tongues. We want to kind of homogenize the Malay language, which I think is really quite a disaster. It already does operate on different parallels. For example, in spoken Malay, in Pasar Malay, in colloquial Malay, and then in written Malay, of course, it's different. I think a lot of this is actually the result of a confrontation between two entities today who are very irritating to public life, if I may say so. One of them is the ethno-nationalists who use this perceived, nobody's respecting the Malay language and so on, as a means to politically exploit it. That's one faction. Right. The other faction, of course, is the heavily middle-class, lumpen bourgeois, English-speaking only. Despite I've got my SPM in Bahasa and did all my education in Bahasa, I don't speak Malay terribly well. These people who suffer from what Frantz Fanon called a colonial hangover, and who are the wretched of the earth, who cannot seem to get any sense of self beyond an affirmation of the former colonial powers. These people also do exist amidst the ethno-nationalists, and I think they complement each other, while everybody else goes around pursuing their own interests in Bahasa Melayu, their own poetry in Bahasa Melayu, without paying much attention to these two forces. So I think this is the reality on the ground.
Now, I have to bring up, of course, the Indonesia's Minister of Education, Culture and Research and Technology rejecting Malaysia's proposal to make Bahasa Melayu, or the Malay language itself, ASEAN's second language. He says the proposal needs to be studied further and stressed that the Indonesian language deserves to be recognized as ASEAN's second language. Considering its history and legacy, your thoughts, Edith?
Yeah, well, let me just say this. First of all, he did not reject, He said it required further study. And of course, when we made this proclamation in Indonesia, it is not like you would not expect the Indonesians to react in this kind of way. We have to see Indonesia, but this is what happens, of course, when you bring language into the realm or the landscape of power politics, regional power politics, The Indonesians, of course, they claim, although Bahasa Melayu is the foundational grounds of Bahasa Indonesia, it has had a different experience altogether. Bahasa Indonesia is a result of an entire revolutionary culture, while ours, Bahasa Melayu, is still pretty much faithful to the genesis of Bahasa Melayu. So they do see Bahasa Indonesia as being different. There's also a political dimension, of course, a country of 300 million people emerging fast as a as an emerging tiger, will want the acknowledgement given to them. But nevertheless, I mean, there is a lot of room for dialogue. And again, to look at the similarities in this culture, Rumpun culture, right, this diasporic culture, rather than allow for the boundaries to inhibit us. And you know, again, there has been a lot of interaction in the past 50 years, 60 years between the Malay and Indonesian languages in literature, in culture, and so on. And I think these things need to be taken a step forward, rather than this being pronounced merely by prime ministers and bureaucrats. That's the one good way of killing any kind of language.
Exactly. Now, I have one more question before we bring in our other two guests. The government will amend the Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka DBP Act 1959. This is to allow the DBP to take action against any violation of the Bahasa Melayu usage, including at the district level. And our Prime Minister says foreign students studying in Malaysia will be compelled to learn Bahasa Malaysia. What's your take on these efforts?
Well, foreign students who come here don't need to be compelled because they want to learn Bahasa Melayu anyway. Secondly, I don't think any of these kinds of punitive, this is where, you know, Bahasa Melayu, ala the administration and institution, alienates everybody else. And I use alienate because I can't use a stronger word, yeah? It alienates everybody else. This is not the way and approach, because in the end, people will just continue to interact in Bahasa Melayu in the most respectable ways, but one that is full of empathy. Nobody's going to listen to institutions to tell us how to speak. That is as ridiculous as it gets, I'm afraid I have to say.
Now, I would like to bring in our other two guests to join in conversation about appreciating Bahasa Melayu. Dr. KABUYE UTHMAN SULAIMAN, Assistant Professor, Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences from IIUM, as well as NORDIN Abdullah, Crisis Management Analyst. Thanks for joining us, guys. We've been having a conversation with EDDIN and would like to, of course, have the both of you weigh in on the topic of conversation. Perhaps let's get a bit of a feedback. What do you guys love about Malaysia and Bahasa Melayu? Let's start with you, Nordin, then I go to you, Dr. KABUYE. Nordin.
Well, very simple, Elaine. For me, the most important part of a language is being able to order good food. You know, and if you don't understand, you know how to get your hands on all the good nasi lemak and roti canai. So I think this is. For me, but all jokes aside, for me, language and culture go hand in hand. And with that, I think the deep relationship between culture and food also needs to be understood. So when you start to package this in a deeper context, you start to realize that there's more to offer than just the language.
And you're almost 100% Malaysian because all you talk about is food. Any Malaysian must say, sudah makan? It's all about food. Dr. KABUYE, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, in my case, actually, there are so many things I love about Malaysia. I've been here for more than 24 years, actually around 27 years. I've enjoyed staying in Malaysia, otherwise I would have left a long time ago. I like the attitude of gratitude among the Malaysians. So there are people who appreciate, actually, no matter how small the things may be. So being a lecturer at International Islamic University, of course, I experienced this. Every semester, when we come to the end of the semester, Malaysian students will come to my office and say, halalkan ilmu, saya minta maaf kalau ada kesalahan. So they are appreciating the knowledge that I have imparted on them, the values, and I really love it.
Sorry, we just lost this audio. Dr. KABUYE, we can't hear you.
Makes you feel good because you are appreciated by your students, and wherever you go, people appreciate.
Dr. KABUYE, we're having trouble hearing your communication. We'll have to take a short break from you, perhaps. Nordin, perhaps you want to weigh in a little bit on what are the conversations that I was having with EDDIN earlier with regards to having Bahasa Melayu as ASEAN second language. Perhaps you have some thoughts on this.
Say the last part again. Your sound popped up there for a second.
Okay. The Bahasa Melayu being proposed as ASEAN's second language. Whether you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea. When you start to look at the convergence of ASEAN as a political entity, often people start to compare it with the EU. And of course, EU has many languages. And I was watching one of the heads of the EU give a press conference the other day. And, he was comfortably shifting between French and Spanish and English. It was very comfortable to see that. And I think this is a celebration of almost an EU culture that, you have people who are multilingual and functionally multilingual, not just, enough to order roti canai. But, what we're talking about now is, are we moving down this path of creating this deeper ASEAN identity around some of the key languages? And of course, if you were to pick one language that would be the second language, Malay would definitely be your first choice. And then you're going to have to say, the Thais will come and say, okay, we want it as well. And there will be this lovely competition for cultural development. And I think this is where we start to understand each other better. And I think that is what we're looking at in terms of a convergence of ASEAN as an idea. And ideas are all taking place in the form of language. So there are some ideas that are best had in the Malay language. There's some ideas that are best had in the Thai language. So it's a question of what language do you speak in, what language can you think in? And then you start to realize that you need to sometimes think in different languages to understand different cultures so that you can find different solutions to different problems. And I think this is a deeper idea.
Yeah, that's true. Now, some things do not translate well from one language to the other, and you have to communicate it in that language, and there are no parallels in another way to translate it. Edin, do you have any comments with regards to whatever that Nordin has just mentioned with regards to the ASEAN multilingualness of it all?
Yeah, no, I think one of the major problems we have is a real lack of understanding about history, not just the history of our country, but the history of the region. We need to appreciate that we are a diasporic and highly polyglot region, and that while you can advocate, harnessing or enhancing the Malay language, I think our real push is for those in Malaysia to be truly at least trilingual, because that is our social reality, and within ASEAN to be multilingual. I think any idea of harnessing or elevating a national language so that people become mutes in other languages and become monolingual is really a mad idea. And I really do believe that I think the administration has to be a little more honest. If the administration itself is grappling with the problem of bilingualism or multilingualism, then they should say so. They shouldn't force everybody else in the country to adopt a kind of monolingualism. We need to be very honest about this. And again, I think all these approaches to punitive and take legal action against people about the way they use the Malay language is really an authoritarian impulse that really has no place in our democratic society today, especially after 2018.
Exactly. And I think you mentioned this earlier as well, how language is supposed to be organic, it's supposed to grow, it's supposed to be able to flex, it's supposed to be able to cross cultures. Dr. KABUYE, tell us about teaching Malay heritage, which of course includes language. What's your approach in teaching this?
Well, this is one of the most interesting subjects I teach at IIUM, and I always enjoy teaching it to the international students. So the main objective, of course, of offering the subject is to expose the international students to Malaysian culture, Budi Melayu, which is also Budi Islam. So we want them to know the history of Budi Melayu, of Budi Islam, to appreciate the Malay culture, and also to be exposed to the Malay heritage itself, because Malays have contributed greatly to the intellectual development. But I want them also to know about the Malay civilization. So how Malaysians interact. So this is very important because the interaction among Malaysians is something very unique. It is not something that you'll find in many countries. So Malaysians peacefully coexist. So it means that they have succeeded in living together. They have reached the level of intellectual maturity. This is where you appreciate others, you appreciate the diversity. So Malaysians are able to prove it because we can see what is going in other countries. People are not able to accept others. They are not able to live together. Muslims and people of other faiths are not able to coexist. So you see it in Malaysia here. So this is one of the things that I want my students to know. But of course, I want them to appreciate the language. So one of the things that I assign the students to do is to find out one pantone that is related to a particular topic and then write about it, or a peribahasa, so that they will appreciate the language, because without knowing the pantone, without knowing peribahasa, there is no way to appreciate a language. So these are some of the assignments I give them, but I also want them to interact with the community. So I ask them to go out and attend Malay weddings, sometimes even to go to the museums to see what are the things that Malaysia has achieved in the past and what are the things that Malaysia continue to achieve today. So this is the way I approach the subject, and everybody appreciates it actually.
Fantastic. I have forgotten about pantones and peribahasas and how beautiful it is and how it communicates so much in so few words. Nordin, being here for this many years, perhaps you have some comments with regards to, learning Malay, being in the culture, any comments with regards to utilizing of the Malay language and communicating in Bahasa. You can speak in Bahasa, yes?
Yes, definitely I can speak.
Sorry, Nordin.
I think it's not an issue. Well, for me, not an official peribahasa, for me, one of my favorite Malay sentences is bila kecil-kecil tak mampu sekarang dah besar nak menyusahkan orang. Which is, of course, a famous line from a P. Ramlee movie. If I'm not mistaken, it's Laksmana Do Re Mi. Of course, Do Re Mi is not Malay words. These are in English, from the English language, and reminds me of the sound of music. But
right.
The question now, and it goes on what EDDIN was saying earlier, this concept of an evolving language. And Malay language is an incredibly fast evolving language. So I think one of the things that we've got to look at is how do we understand the different parts of the language and the different parts of the culture, and understand it in the youngster context. I saw some of my children's WhatsApp in Malay. There's all kinds of short forms for all kinds of words. It takes you like 10 minutes to translate it. And I get it now. So that is actually the living part of the language. Some of the things, if you're going to do a movie on certain parts of what's going on in Kelantan, for example, there's a certain part of that context and that communication that goes on in Kelantan, which is different to Johor. Actually, all of this needs to be celebrated. Yes, you have your official body of work, which comes from the government, but everything.
Oh, we've lost Nordin again. We're having some audio issues. Now we have about 2-3 minutes left. EDDIN, I would like to sort of close off this session with you speaking about what are perhaps your views and your final thoughts with regards to appreciating Bahasa Melayu, and how do we sort of wrap this with regards to whoever's watching, the rakyat, everyone that's looking at this, internationally acceptable or international appeal of the language. Perhaps you have some final comments with regards to for us.
Yeah, I think a great deal of investment needs to be put in the language, investment into things like translation, investment into stimulating Malay studies or Malaysian studies the world over. Again, we do not need to take this punitive approach, although of course bureaucrats only understand that kind of thing. But I think there has already been a backlash, and I think people need to pay a lot of close attention to what people are saying. If you want to elevate the Malay language, please invest as was reminded by the father of the Malay language, Pendeta Zaba, essentially about how the Malay language needs to interact with the rest of the world. And we need to enhance things like translation. We set up the National Institute of Translation many, many decades ago when Anwar Ibrahim was Minister of Education. And all they did for years and years and years was produce one, you know, the typical hardcover kind of coffee table things that nobody reads, but they throw at each other when they're in a rage, that kind of thing after years and years and years. So I think this question also allows a lot of room for us to call for accountability of people like Dewan Bahasa, for people like Institute Terjemahan Negara about what they have done. So let's broaden the debate, if we will.
Thank you so much, Edin, for sharing your thoughts. And I'd like to end this session perhaps with any message in Bahasa from Dr. KABUYE. You have a message for us in Bahasa Malaysia?
I don't have much to say, but saya memang nak cakap saya dalam di sini 27 tahun dan saya rasa gembira tinggal di negara ini. Alhamdulillah, tak ada apa-apa masalah. So terima kasih banyak-banyak.
Terima kasih. And NORDIN, any final messages in BM for us? You're mute. You're on mute.
Okay, terima kasih untuk hari ini. Tapi I nak cakap selamat berbuka puasa kepada semua orang dan selamat berbuka puasa and enjoy Ramadan.
Thank you so much. Edin, any final message in Bahasa to all of us?
Ya, selamat berbulan Ramadan. Selamat berbulan Ramadan dan semoga diberkati rahmat selalulah.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih to all our viewers who are watching us today on The Nation. Let's appreciate Bahasa Melayu. Let's enjoy it. Let's share it. Let's spread it. That's all the time that we have. Thanks for joining me on The Nation. I'm Elaine Abdullah. I was speaking to, of course, my three very special guests, the co-founder of PUSAKA and Senior Fellow ISIS Malaysia, NORDIN Abdullah, Crisis Management Analyst, as well as Dr. KABUYE Sulaiman, Assistant Professor for Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences, IIUM. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.